Hi, everybody. My name is Chris Merritt. I'm the State Historic Preservation Officer here in Utah, and I run the State Historic Preservation Office. And this is our very first conference that we have run as a office. We work very closely with Preservation Utah, our statewide nonprofit, to put this on. So thank you all for joining this year. It's really exciting. As some of you probably found out, we actually hit our maximum registration pretty quickly. And so there's 30 plus people that are on the wait list, and we would have let them in, except the fire marshal probably would not have preferred that. So I wanted to just welcome everybody to this beautiful, beautiful building. And we selected this location because it is a beautiful example of how we can save community treasures, historic buildings, and repurpose them for the next generation of use. So we're going to have Dusty Jansen talking to us today about place names. But one of the things that we really thought was interesting about this is how this space is new. It is an old historic school. It's been around for a long time, as you can see in your program, the history of it. But for a long time, it's been known as the Columbus School or the Columbus Center. Just recently, South Salt Lake has now shifted its name to the South Salt Lake Community Center. And so that is obviously in relation to the use of the word Columbus and that interaction with Native peoples. And so it's an interesting reshaping of the place name here, but also just a really good example of what a community can do when we band together to save a building. So I first want to thank South Salt Lake City. They are amazing partners. If any of you are looking for a venue to have a conference, please check this place out. It is amazing. Second, thank you is to all our partners. This year we did not ask for any donations from our partners, just because we wanted to make sure this was successful and also make sure everybody could join, and we absorbed it out of our own budget, and we appreciate everybody and our partners. The other thing I want to point out, got to thank my staff who pulled this together, Amber Anderson, Jansen Bennett, Corey, all these guys, everybody at the SHPO staff pulled together and really made this awesome. The other place I really want to highlight a big thank you, if you're a part of the Cultural Site Stewardship Program, can you please raise your hand? I want to thank these folks. These folks are part of our volunteer effort to help protect and safeguard cultural resources statewide. So turning our land managers into an army of caring people. So these folks donate their time, their money to protect our joint heritage. So thank you, stewards. So what the heck is a SHPO? We get that question quite a bit in my line of work. Some people think it's a four-letter word because you can use it that way. All 50 states and 9 territories and protectorates have a SHPO. This comes out of the 1966 National Historic Preservation Act, which was the first federal legislation to mandate that federal partners had to take into account their actions on historic preservation, on cultural resources. This is the act that gives us not only my office, but also Certified Local Government Program, our historic tax credits, the National Register of Historic Places. And so in that passage of that federal law, the federal government, in its wisdom, said that each state should have its own office to help direct and inform those federal agencies working within that state boundaries, to be the local experts for those agencies to rely on. Our office, the best I can figure out, started in 1969 when we received our first federal grant from the National Park Service. And we have now we're 40 years plus into our office's life, and we're cooking. I have 17 full-time staff, and the state keeps adding more awesome programs. So the other big thing that we've added last year was the Utah Main Street program, which is not normally housed in a SHPO, but the Governor's Office of Economic Opportunity said, hey, who's really doing good work statewide, who has an infrastructure and a parent department of cultural and community engagement that can bring all the different focuses to help our communities revitalize their downtowns. And so they gave it to our office last year, and so there's also a bunch of Main Street community members in here. So I thank you guys here. The SHPO is meant to really be the voice of preservation in the state. And so I'm really thankful for you guys coming here today to hear that. When I started working for the state 10 years ago, I saw really a fractured discipline. I walked into an archaeology shop that the historic buildings were different than the archaeology. We didn't talk, we didn't collaborate. Our agency partners weren't in the same place as we wanted. So I've worked 10 years with my great partners and my leadership to build a coalition. Because I don't care if you're in a Main Street community, you're a steward, you're an archaeologist, you're a preservationist, or you're just a person that lives in a cool old home. We're all on the same team. We're all pulling the same direction to save our cultural heritage in all its forms, and they're telling the unique stories of Utah. So the SHPO is that. We're trying to build that voice. We're trying to work with all our partners because my small office can't do everything. We rely on you all to be the boots on the ground to help us. And as Utah continues to have amazing growth and development, we're going to rely on you even more to help be the voice of balancing the need of historic preservation with the pressures of development. There are ways that we can work together, and this building is a good example of how we can not level and build new, but repurpose old, capture those stories, remember that community input, and protect it for the next generation. So I'm going to try to be quick today, but I wanted to highlight 2 projects. We didn't do awards this year just because Preservation Utah does have their awards gala. But I wanted to highlight 2 projects. The first is multi-year down in St. George City. The city, with 2 avocational archaeologists, have worked diligently for 3 to 4 years to document and identify cultural resources on city lands, which aren't protected by federal law. They're not protected by state law. And as you know, St. George is undergoing amazing growth, and it will for another generation. So having the baseline of understanding of where these precious cultural resources are gives the city a tool to help guide development to protect these sites. Most of these sites are Native American, ancestral Puebloan, all the way up to the Paiute. And these places, without knowledge of their location, without the city taking advantage of those informational points, we could lose them. And we're working collaboratively with St. George City to bring. I invited them up here. No one could make it from St. George. But we have some amazing volunteers down there. Greg Woodall and Todd Prince, 2 retired or semi-retired archaeologists who won't let anybody forget the effort of protecting these cultural resource sites down in St. George. And so they lead tours to some of the sites. They're working collaboratively to find conservation easements to protect some of these ancestral Puebloan villages and burial sites, all in direct partnership with St. George City. So I appreciate St. George City and kind of being a leader in trying to protect our archaeological heritage here in the state and still connect that to our modern day life. The second project I want to highlight is up in Park City. If you've been up to Park City to recreate, ski, or just go shopping, you recognize that a lot of Park City's mining history has disappeared from its downtown. The mining history of Park City is still there, though. It's just up in the mountains where the mines actually were. And so through the Park City Mining Museum, the Friends of Ski Mountain Mining History formed just before COVID to start pulling together resources to save these mine structures before they disappear. And so I do think somebody from the Friends of Ski Mountain Mining History came today. Are they here in the room? Awesome, we got a couple folks. Thank these guys. These folks took it upon themselves to save the mining history, not relying on government, not relying on the city, but spearheading a grassroots effort to save this precious mining history that we lose every single winter with our snow loads. And I know this year there was another collapse up on some of these mining sites. And so thank you to these guys. And to give you an idea, they're not just saving them in memory, they're saving them by doing great historic rehabilitation. And so you can see the little bell orb in here on the left, looking a bit shabby, a little tilty. Historic buildings shouldn't be really tilty unless they're designed that way. But through the fundraising and sweat equity of the Friends of Ski Mountain mining history, you can see now it's preserved. But there's so much more to be done. If you're interested in learning more about them and joining and supporting them, capture these guys that raised their hands, talk to them. If you're interested, reach out to any of my staff and we'll put you in contact, because these are the grassroots efforts that we need to make sure that our heritage moves forward. If we rely solely on government, that will never happen. We all have to pitch in. We cannot wait for somebody else to do the hard work. Sometimes you just have to do it yourselves. And I'll do everything in my power to support those awesome, awesome efforts. And so those are 2 project highlights that I wanted to cover today because they are truly grassroots efforts. They're not coming from a government or an organizational push. It's coming from the community itself. That is where the best preservation comes from. I don't live in your community, unless you live in Bountiful. I want you all to say, in your community, what can you do to help preserve these stories? Every day we lose something. And guess what? We always will. That is the nature of historic preservation. I sometimes say that historic preservation feels like ambulance chasing, because it kind of is. Usually by the time we hear about a building being demolished, it's too late to save it. So how do we stop that from happening is to be preemptive, to be proactive, to work with your city leaders. And even if they don't want to listen, you keep saying it. Work as a nonprofit. Work with your local government to find opportunities to save places. These places are what makes St. George, and Richfield, Richfield. If we lose more and more of that historic fabric as a state, we lose that ability to connect to our roots. I am not a Utahn. I'm a Michigander, and I'm going to do that. But I've now lived in Utah for over 10 years, and I love every corner of this state because it's unique. Every place has a unique story. We have 13,000 years of human history in the state of Utah. There is not a corner of this state that does not have some connection to our joint human history. And so I urge you all, take what you learned today with all the sessions that we've carefully curated to kind of span the depth and breadth of what Utahns do. We have archaeology, we have historic preservation, we have archivists, we have straight history, because we're all doing the same work, but we don't talk enough. We don't collaborate enough. So I want this conference for the years to go forward to continue to build that community of people that care, because there's more people in Utah who care about old things than we give them credit for. We just need to find ways to connect them to their history. So there's my soapbox. And to continue that story, as I think you all feel it, in the last few years, we have dedicated more of our time as a state agency, and a nation to help bring indigenous voices to the story of preservation. It is not something that is sidelined. It's not anecdotal. These folks are here. These tribes never left. They still are connected to these places. And sometimes you have to remind even archaeologists to treat them as living descendant communities, not some relic of the past. And so I'm really thrilled to bring up Dusty Jansen to speak to you today. He is my partner in crime over at the Department of Culture and Community Engagement, and I really appreciate him being able to give you some insight into his perspectives on some topics of place names. Now, I asked him to give me a bio that was slightly different than what's in your program, so I hate to do this, but I'm going to read now. My reading voice is not as fun as my talking voice. So Dustin Jansen is originally from Coyote Canyon, New Mexico. He was born and raised on the Navajo Reservation, where he is an enrolled member. Dustin received his Science Associates of Science from Utah Valley University, his History Bachelor's from Brigham Young University, and his Juris Doctorate from the University of Utah S.J. Quinney College of Law. So he's a lawyer, so be careful when you talk to him. Dustin practiced as an attorney and judge in the tribal court systems for nearly 18 years. He served as a judge for the Confederated Tribes of the Goshute Reservation, a hearing officer for the Navajo Nation Office of Hearings and Appeals, pro tem judge and Zuni Pueblo, and has been teaching at UVU since the fall of 2015, where he recently was awarded tenure, which is a big deal. Congrats, Dusty. Dustin is the program coordinator for the American Indian Studies program there. Since February of 2020, Dustin has served as director of the Utah Division of Indian Affairs as installed by Governor Herbert. And so before I turn the time over to Dusty, I just want to say that Dustin's shop is small but mighty. He only has 3 permanent employees for the entire Division of Indian Affairs. I would love that to be 10 full-time people because the work that Dustin and his crew do is helping connect the state of Utah, the government, to our tribal residents in a way that has not really been done before. Dustin is passionate, his staff are passionate, but they're overworked. We have this awesome Native American Summit at the end of June. That is an amazing event, but again, pulled together by 3 mighty staff in his team. So, Dusty, I will stop pontificating and hand the time to you, sir.
Well, I actually had a hard time coming up with remarks today. I started off writing and it got really boring and academic, so I threw it away. And then I started writing and it got really Indian. And so I was like, I better step back just a little bit from there. So hopefully it's something in between. I decided to share stories with you. about different areas that I saw, that I knew growing up, that I visited, and that were personal to me. And I hope that you just take that as some general Native perspective, and hopefully it's something that you can take with you to your workplace or just with you in your personal life and put it to use and apply it somehow. I want to tell you a story, though, about Tutokanula. Okay. And the story goes that there was a bear and her 2 cubs that were walking and foraging for food. I'm sorry if I have a hard time speaking, because for some reason I thought it'd be a good idea to get braces when you're 50. But they were walking and foraging for food, and the two bear cubs got tired, and so they just laid down on this rock and went to sleep. And the mama bear kept going and foraging for her food. And as she kept foraging and finding food to eat and building up her body fat, the rock that her bear cubs were on started to grow. And it went. Some stories say it went straight up through the clouds and high enough where they scraped their faces on the moon. Others say it just got really high. But either way, the mother bear couldn't get her cubs down. She had a hard time climbing, and it was so high she couldn't jump. And so she called for help. And the beings that came to help her were first a fox, and he jumped and couldn't make it. And the mouse jumped, and he jumped even lower, right? And the rat jumped, and he couldn't make it. And even later, a raccoon tried climbing up, couldn't do it. A mountain lion tried doing it, couldn't do it. And while they were doing this, an inchworm started going up the side of the mountain, just really slow and steady. And they said about a day into her climb, she was about as high as those animals were jumping. But she kept climbing up this cliff face. And she did it, and she climbed for 1 full winter. And at the end of that winter, she made it to the top and told the bear cubs that she was there to help them get down. Obviously, she's an inchworm, so she can't carry bears down, but she taught them the path down, the path that she used to climb up. And she reunited these bear cubs with their parent. Tutokanula is a Miwok word for inchworm rock. Okay, and the most preeminent Miwok UTSHPO basket weaver and an ambassador of the Yosemite Museum. Her name is Julia Parker, and she explains. She shares the story a lot. If you look her up, she'll share the story a lot online, and it was touching to me, right? Animals helping each other. I grew up with stories like that. Animals helping each other, and we're supposed to learn from that. But now imagine this. Right? Now imagine a peak so intimidating, it's called El Capitan, right? But if you try to figure out where that name came from, it was a name derived from conquest, right? It was a name derived by the Mariposa Battalion, who was actually sent into the Yosemite Valley to eradicate and remove the native people that were in that valley. And they think that he named it El Capitan, the leaders of that battalion, because he misunderstood the word. He thought it meant chief's face. So he substituted chief for the Spanish equivalent. So he put captain, right, and named it El Capitan. But the people that he was removing there, they were the Awahiche Indians. And, they had lived there a good amount of time. And they actually called that valley Awahine, which means where the mouth opens. So just describing the valley, right? Where it opens up. But it's probably not as cool as El Capitan, right? We have this guy climbing here. Does anybody know who he is? Yeah, there you go. Alex Honnold. He's the only man to ever scale El Capitan free climbing. You can watch it on Disney. It's scary as hell. All right, I'll just share that. But for him, he said, I wanted to test myself against El Cap. It represented true mastery. Now, the name Yosemite itself was a mishear also. The natives there called the area Usamate. But sometimes when we can't spell what we're hearing, we change it to something close, right? We do that a lot. I did it with Yosemite myself as a child. I used to watch Yosemite Sam, right? Cartoons. And I never knew he was saying Yosemite. This is going to sound crazy, and you're not going to let me live this down. I thought he was saying Samity Sam for my whole life. I never learned. I was living in Idaho in 2010, I think, when my wife was like, what did you call him? And I was like, Samity Sam? And she was like, his name's Yosemite Sam. I'm like, that makes more sense than what I was thinking. But it was all just what I heard, right? And I heard it wrong. And a friend of mine from California actually married a girl from my high school, and we ended up living in Idaho together. We ran into each other, we ended up working at the same place. And we used to eat barbecues there, and I went over one Sunday and I said, yeah, Chama's making, my wife's name is Chama, and I said, Chama's making fun of me because I was saying Samity Sam instead of, and her husband Mike started laughing, my wife started laughing again, and then his wife said, it's not Samity Sam. so it's not just me, but it also tells that sometimes we hear things wrong, and we write them down wrong, we record them wrong, and sometimes because of that mess up, the meaning behind those things changes, right? Samity Sam means nothing, right? Yosemite Sam kind of tells you he's probably a 49er out of California, and he was there, right? That name means something. To Yosemite Sam. To the tribes that lived in the Yosemite Valley, though, they call it Usamate, which is kind of not really close to Yosemite, but whatever, we can get there. But for the southern Miwok, this term, right, this inchworm rock, it's still a story of patience, sacrifice, smallness, and of course probably resilience. Okay, and you look at what Alex Honnold was able to do. Was he not all those things, right? Was he not everything that inchworm was? Would Tutokanula have the same meaning for Alex Honnold had he known what that meant and what that story stood for, right? And sure it would. It translates across. It would have translated across to him, and because this Alex Honnold has a respect for everything he touches. I mean, you watch this documentary, and he has a fear for this mountain face, this cliff face, and he also has a love for it. He has an admiration for it, and he treats it that way. And I was watching this documentary with my wife and kids, and my son said, "How come he's the only one that could do it?" And that's what my wife said. My wife said, because he respects that cliff, he respects that mountain, and so that mountain helped him come up. And that sounds odd, giving that personification to a mountain, a cliff, but that's kind of how we were brought up. We were brought up that everything's alive. Everything has a spirit. and because of that, it can help you or hurt you. And so I thought that was cool what Alex Honnold was doing. If you listen to me speak sometimes, I'll bring this up a lot. Wilma Mankiller, she was the vice president of the Cherokee Nation in the early 1990s. She was actually the first elected president, female elected president of the Cherokee Nation. And she served her term and then ended up going on speaking tours and writing academically in journals. But one of the things that she always said was public perception creates public policy. And I share this with you because I'm hoping that what I say will make a little more sense to you. Hopefully it's easier to find a place within you to keep, because what does this mean? It means how we see things really determines how we treat them. How we see people really determines how you treat people. Sometimes my students at UVU will ask me, because we'll study. I was walking through the hallway here, and they had the Tulsa Little Africa burning, right? There's pictures of that in this hallway here. And we discuss that sometimes in different events that happen in the U.S. And they ask me sometimes, hey, does racism still exist? And I said, probably, yeah. For the person receiving it. But it's probably more subtle, Sometimes it's not. We can watch the news and see that. But I did tell them, I said, I can't tell you who's racist or any one individual is racist because I don't know everybody. But what you can do is, if you really want to know what people think about you, look at the legislation that affects you. Look at the laws that come into your life and determine what you can and cannot do. And if those aren't right, if you find those aren't right, then you can change those. And hopefully we can learn to see each other, learn to see how others see things in a different way. That might change your perspective. That might influence how you treat them and how you take it and use it into your work. So I like to have this in your brain, and I'll end with this too, just to reinforce it. Place names and the stories behind them and how we perceive and connect to landscape. Today we live in a world that's named after sometimes conquistadors, where I grew up in the Southwest. Everything's a San or a Santa, somebody, right? Or the colonization of westward expansion, or even eastward expansion, if you want to do that, where we have names like Washington or Jefferson or Jackson, and we see those names everywhere. To some people, that may mean that may invoke a lot of pride, but to a lot of Native people, they may not feel that same way because of the influence that these individuals may have had on them. And you're going to find that, and I'll get to this in a little bit, that Native people don't really name places after people. It's a rarity when you see that happen. But I hope that with the names that I'm going to share with you today, a few locations, that you'll see you'll be able to see the land and landscape underneath that name. I hope you'll be able to see the story underneath that name, and I hope that you'll contemplate a little bit on what names of geographic locations may mean to the human mind and to the indigenous mind, where places, their names have been changed from an indigenous name to something different. Okay, and so just keep and when you're as Native people are sometimes referred to as a conquered people. If you're a conquered people, how does it feel to have the conqueror's name around you all the time? It's hard. It's hard to deal with. And where I grew up, there was a place where I grew up called Washington Pass. And there was a major that met a group of Navajo people there. And they got into it and they killed all the Navajo people. And one of the people they killed was a chief named Narbona. And for years, that place was known as Washington Pass because of that fight. And that was like right behind my school. Right there, I grew up on the Navajo Reservation. And right before I graduated high school, they changed it to Narbona Pass. For these reasons, what's the power in a name? But I'd hope you could see that there is power in that name, and that name, it affects people differently. And changing that name to Narbona in honor of a Navajo chief rather than the military major that killed Navajo people, it changed how people see that pass and their desire to go up there and visit, because it's a beautiful area. That's why they chose that area to meet before they got into that battle. So just keep that in mind. This place, how you say it in Navajo is Dokoslid. Okay, it's what we all know as the San Francisco Peaks, just right outside Flagstaff or right next to Flagstaff. I don't know how Flagstaff people measure that. It's our mountain. I don't know. But a Navajo poet laureate stated, "A lot of places are attached to story, and those stories are important for us to remember because they are telling us something about ourselves and our past. These stories provide a sense of belonging." In Navajo, for mountain, we say zith. Okay, that just means Navajo. That means mountain in Navajo. It's derived from another word meaning strength, zith. That's how you say it. So zith and zith. Navajo has a lot of words like that sound almost exactly alike. Like azate and azate. So azate's medicine, but azate is your mouth. Whatever. It makes sense to me. But Dokoslid means perpetually covered in snow. Okay. And there was there's a new ski basin that was getting built up there back in 01 or 02. And they were fighting it. The Hopi tribe and the Navajo Nation were fighting it because there was no more snow staying up there consistently. And so what they were doing was they were making snow. I'm sure you've all seen it. We all live in Utah. They were making snow, but the snow they were using to make, the water they were using to make that snow was from the sewer area of Flagstaff, their wastewater. And so the Navajo and Hopi tribe, who have cultural links to this mountain, right? It's where you gather medicine. It's where holy people live. For the Hopi people, it's where some of the Kachinas sleep before they come back out and visit the Hopi people. And they just thought, dude, why are you pouring sewer water on this mountain? Why are you doing that here? And they said, well, we don't have that much snow anymore, and we have to do it, and that's where we're getting the water from. And they said, well, if you treated the mountain right, maybe there would be more snow, right? There's this, and they're like, no, it's global warming and we don't get enough snow, right? And so there's this ideological fight on what should happen to this mountain. But I'd like, the Navajo people and the Hopi people are saying we can't just, when you go into a mountain, you just don't go into it haphazardly and just go run around and do the things that you want. You have to approach that with respect, much like the climber on the El Capitan, what he did. When you approach water, you should approach it with respect. My grandma would say, you should introduce yourself when you approach these great things. Like, hey, mountain, this is me. I'm going to hang out here, and she would say that. I grew up in the Southwest. We had rattlesnakes all over. And I remember one morning I opened my front door and there was a rattlesnake coiled up. And I was like, oh, crap. And I shut the door. And I went out the back, opened the back door, and there was another one on my back door. I think they're just the heat coming from the house, and that's where they were at. But they were cold, they're like, ugh. So I just stepped over one, and I went and got a rake, and I picked him up. And he was mad, or she, I don't know, I can't tell snake sex. But as I was walking it over to the fence, to toss it over the fence into the wilderness, right? I looked over, and the Navajo Nation built these little subdivisions in the middle of nowhere, where there's a bunch of houses all in little groups. My neighbors were pulling snakes off their front yard too. And I was like, what? And I come to find out there's a snake pit close to where I grew up. And it's a ball of snakes in a hole. It is scary as hell. But a lot of the Hopi people will come to the Navajo Nation and they'll grab snakes for their ceremonies because they dance with snakes. Sometimes you'll see pictures of they'll carry them in their mouths when they dance, but that's where they go to get their snakes. Who knew? I was like, but it was about when my grandma came and my mom told my grandma, hey, this is what happened. And so my grandma went outside and in Navajo, she said, all you snakes that are around here, stay away from my house. You could get hurt here. You could hurt somebody here. Don't come here anymore. And then so she would say that. If you don't want something coming around your house, just say it out loud. They'll hear you. And so I went out. Chief of police. Just kidding. No, I was gonna. I was in high school when that happened, but I still remember it. I remember her saying that to me, and it affected me and how I do things. It's affected how I teach my kids and how I share things with them. But approaching these things, these animals, these places, with respect, you'll get respect in return. I remember we lived about 132 miles from Albuquerque, New Mexico. And New Mexico is a lot like Utah, a lot of rural areas and like one big area. But our one big area is like nowhere near the size of Salt Lake. It's a pretty small valley. The Albuquerque Valley, Bernalillo County is pretty sparse, and Albuquerque is a pretty small town. But on the east side of Albuquerque, there's these mountains here, and they're called the Sandia Peaks. And Sandia in Spanish means watermelon because a lot of times they look like pink or red in the sunlight, and it's a beautiful area. But I remember when your little town doesn't have what you need, you have to drive the 132 miles to Albuquerque. And so we took my grandma once, and she was staying with us, so she jumped in and went with us. And as we came into Gallup, we went downtown and she saw the Sandia Peaks. And she said, as a young girl, my dad would take me here, and that mountain would give us medicine. What she meant was that she and her dad, who was, I guess you would call him a medicine man, and Navajo we call him hatatle because we call them singers. They sing because songs are prayers and they heal you that way. But they went up there and they picked herbs, plants, and different medicines from there. But the way she said it, that mountain gave us medicine, right? It showed me how she views that mountain. It wasn't just this place you visit. This was a living thing. This is something that could give you something, could offer you something, could help you. And it had, because this is where medicine was received, that her dad could use to heal people and to treat different illnesses. And so, in her mind, that mountain gave it to her. And so that's how she approached life. I'm going to approach this with respect. And if I do that, that relationship would reciprocate back and forth. Albuquerque. So there's Albuquerque on the bottom, and you can kind of see the Sandias in the back, right? On the bottom there. And then the others are from Petroglyph National Park. It's just in the Rio Rancho area of Albuquerque. And there's just petroglyphs everywhere. For petroglyphs, Navajo would say their names for that are Tse Hane, which means rocks telling a story. Okay, so that's the word we use all through Chaco Canyon to describe all the rock art or writing there. Albuquerque, we say Beidil Datsanil, and that means the high bell. Okay, in New Mexico was settled by the Spanish people, and they created all the major towns in New Mexico are set up just like probably little towns in Spain. They have a little town square, and there's a government building on one side and Catholic cathedral on the other side, and there's a little gazebo in the middle. You know, they're all set up like this. But when the Navajo people in the late, well, I guess it was in the 1860s, they got rounded up, and they were forced marched from Arizona all the way to the eastern side of New Mexico on something called the Long Walk. Where they were taken was a place called Fort Sumner. The Spanish called it Bosque Redondo, so just the round valley or something like that. But Navajos called it Huelde, which means a place of great suffering. So you can see the different names and how they can affect you from one location. After a while being there, they negotiated their peace and were able to walk all the way back home. And when they got past the Sandia Mountains, so Albuquerque is basically the middle of the state, and so they came from the eastern border of New Mexico all the way into Albuquerque. And when they came in, the Catholic priests saw the Navajos coming in, and they knew where they were coming from, and so they started ringing their bells of their cathedral, beckoning the Navajo people to come in so that they could be clothed and fed and restocked so that they could find the rest of their way home. You know, and most of the Navajos made their way back home. A lot of them stopped just outside of Albuquerque, and it's a place called To'Hajiilee. And then a few more miles, there's another stop in a place called Alamo. And then some of them got to Gallup, which is basically your back home on Navajo Nation. But they went south of Gallup, and they went to a place called Rama. And everyone else went back home to where they're supposed to go. But those names meant something. The names for each of the groups that were part of New Mexico at the time, they all had a meaning, right? For America, Fort Sumner was a military outpost where they could find protection. For the Spanish people, their Bosque Redondo was an area, a round area where that was described where they found peace. But for the Navajo Huelde, it was a whole different experience, and that experience is encapsulated in the name that they gave it. I pulled up something, and it says, psychologists call this place identity, a social constructivist theory designed to shed light on our subjective perceptions of geography, right? How does this affect us? How do names of places affect us, and how do geographic locations affect us? I've had students from Polynesian students at UVU, and they'll tell me that, you know, even if they've never lived on their home island, if they grew up in Utah and stayed here, they said when they first went back home, whether it could be Samoa, Tonga, Fiji, or Hawaii, when they landed there, he goes, I had a number of students tell me this, as soon as I stepped off the plane, I felt taller. I felt stronger, right? There's this tie to land that humans have. And that land becomes a foundation to our belief system. And as long as we share those and keep those alive, they will continue to be that foundation. I thought this would be fun. I threw my picture of my grandma up there. So if you go in the Southwest, a lot of Native people have Spanish names. And so it would make a lot of non-Indians be like, there are no more natives in New Mexico, they're all Spanish people. But what happened was when the Spanish came up, they started building cathedrals and churches all through the Southwest, and then they had some forced conversion for all the tribes down there. And when they were baptized, they gave you a Christian name. And so a lot of Native people have Hispanic last names in the Southwest because those were the people baptizing them and doing that. But a lot of them kept their names. My mom's mom, my grandma Martina Curley. This is her house. That's like a stone house back there that her dad built. And she lived there up until she passed away when she was 87 years old. And that's her weaving a rug. That rug looks a lot better than it really is. my grandma was a really bad weaver. And and she was a really bad silversmith too, all right? And but somehow she made it. She supported herself until she died, until she lived all those years alone. We lived about 100 yards behind that house. But she was a really good person, and I have a lot of memories of her. None more important than the other, but they all remind me that I miss her. I miss her stories, and I miss that love that we had together. We have this man, Curly. Curly is that guy. He was a scout for the 7th Cavalry, and he was helping Custer and the 7th Cavalry round up natives and send them down to Oklahoma Territory. And the Pawnee and the Crow allied themselves with the United States military at the time, and hoping that they would get a better deal at the end of it all. But at the end of it all, they went to the Crow people and said, now we're going to move here. And the Crow people were like, well, okay. And so they ceded some parts of their land to the United States and reserved land to themselves. And the U.S. kept coming back and saying, hey, you need to cede more land. And their reservation kept getting smaller and smaller. And finally, Curly said, no, we can't do this anymore. And the Indian Affairs superintendent said, he was trying to convince him that, hey, you're done, right? Your people's time is over. This is no longer Crow land. This is the United States. And Curly said to him, he said, you'd have to dig very deep into this ground to escape the evidence of my ancestors in this land. He said, this land is filled with the blood and the bones of all my people for thousands of years. And for him, this would always be Crow land, right? And, so he, when I first read that, I was just, wow, that was pretty cool. It's kind of like when I read Geronimo's quote where he said, I should have never surrendered. I should have fought until I was the last one standing. And I was, quotes like that they hit me kind of hard. And I'm like, Geronimo was probably smaller than I was. I'm not very tall. But the confidence he had to think if he would have fought, he would have been the last one standing. I just loved it, But this is what Curly was doing. Hey, we can't give you any more land. You could live here, you can, all around us, and you may say that's yours, and you may, deed it off to someone else. But for us, this will always be Crow land, I see Darren Perry in the back. That's where Indians sit. We usually sit in the back. And I went to church with a bunch of natives in Provo, and it filled up from the back forward. So if you're in the front, it was because you were late. And so I know Darren was here early. That's why he's back there. But we had this, there's this, the northwestern band of Shoshone don't currently have trust land, don't currently have a reservation. But their traditional lands is basically everything north of I-80. That's a large chunk of property, right? And even though there's not a reservation there, to the northwestern band, that's Shoshone land. This is a Shoshone Valley right here. These are, they have a connection to this lake, to these mountains, all the way up to the Bear River, all the way into Idaho. And they have their names and their connection to it. And, and sometimes when we try to overwrite sacred name places with different information, it can disrupt that connection between people and the earth. And so I wanted to share that with you. I had the chance to go to Canada in 2020. I probably infected an entire village with COVID when I went up there because I didn't know I had COVID. Cause I spoke in Tucson at American Indian Studies place, and I was on the plane. I was in the airport for a long time, and everything was going wrong with the plane, and we landed, and I did not feel good. And I thought it was just a bad trip. but I think I caught COVID on that plane because I wasn't feeling very well. But the guys that wanted to take me to Northern Canada, this was the chance, right? It's like golf. If someone invites you to play golf, you go play. Otherwise, you never get invited again. So I was like, they're inviting me to go round dancing, and you'll see these guys are holding drums with in their hands. They call them hand drums, and the people behind them, they're all holding hands, just layers of people, and they're all holding hands, and they dance the beat's just like this. And on that hard beat, you're just kind of going to the side like this, and everyone's holding hands. And as soon as we walked into that gym, it was just packed. I mean, it was sweaty. It was like back in the 90s clubbing days for a lot of you that used to go dance clubbing. It was just like sweaty. And as soon as I walked in, this old man grabbed my hand and an old woman grabbed my hand over here. And next thing you know, I'm going in a circle, right? And I was like, okay, here we go, right off. And we went outside, and the Northern Lights were there. And so I was, I'm from the Southwest. We don't do hand drumming. Navajos don't do hand drumming. And so I was like, why are you doing this? And they said, oh, one of our elders passed away, and so we're going to do this 4 years in a row to remember him. I'm like, why now? Because it was cold. It was in January, right? The last week of January, and they said, well, it's because of this, and they pointed at the Northern Lights. And if you looked at the Northern Lights, they kind of go like this. Okay, it looks like they're moving. And they said, those are our ancestors dancing with us. That's why we do this right now. Because when you bring in the past into meeting with the present, that's just the definition of ceremony. He said, we're not just celebrating a life here. We're celebrating all those that came before us. We're connecting with all of our ancestors in this area. And when we do that, we learn from them and they bless us. There's this idea, much like Curly said, that the blood and bones of my people are always going to be here. So too are the spirits of these people and their influence on you. And I thought that was just beautiful, when they told me that story. And I got to sing there, and they were like, hey, sing some songs. And I didn't bring any. And I'm like, I don't have any. I just came here to listen. And they said, who comes all the way up from Utah only to listen? I'm like, me? So the name for the Northern Lights in Cree is called Tamihiti, and that just means those who are dancing. So it was pretty cool for me to be there and experience that healing. Not just it was emotional healing, a spiritual healing, right? For this widow that was there, for her children that are there. It was a really wonderful experience. I grew up in this place, Coyote Canyon, which really isn't its name. The legal name of this place is called Brimhall, New Mexico. My grandma's house, I'm gonna go back a little bit. See my grandma's house made of stone on there? This is a painting, but that trading post is also made of stone because my great-grandfather built that trading post. He was one of the people that built it. Across the street from there, across the road, it's not really street, across the road, there's like 5 houses all built of stone just like this that they all built for people, for government use. But when that trading post was built, the people that were running that trading post were a family called the Brimhalls out of Mancos, Colorado. And the Brimhalls were, they set it up, and the U.S. Post Office wanted to put a post office inside that trading post. And they did, and so they assigned it a zip code, and they called it Brimhall, New Mexico. Okay. But Mr. Brimhall and Mrs. Brimhall, they would call the place Coyote Canyon because they couldn't say the name in Navajo. The name in Navajo is Ma'iti'ishtleja, which means where the coyote fell. And so they just called it Coyote Canyon because the coyote fell in the canyon back there. So the story behind that is there was this coyote, and he was chasing a rain cloud. He was thirsty, and he would chase it and get tired and rest, and he'd get up, and that rain cloud would keep getting further and further away from him. And so he just kept chasing it. One day he said, I'm not gonna stop until I get it. And so he went after it, and he went after it so hard that he passed out. And he woke up. he realized he passed out, and he saw the cloud in the distance, but he felt that the ground was wet around him. And he could smell rain, and he could smell water. And so he looked around, and on the edge of this cliff was a small, shallow puddle of water. And so they said he leaned over as far as he could to get some water and kept leaning until his tongue just got it. And he took a few laps, and then he tumbled down the canyon. He didn't die. He got up, quenched his thirst, and went after that rain cloud again. Growing up here, I ended up learning a whole bunch of coyote stories because I was from Coyote Canyon, right? Why not? But that story just teaches you about resilience. It teaches you that there is reward after you go after things. It teaches you that sometimes you can't rest. Sometimes you have to keep chasing it. Sometimes you'll catch it and it'll get away, and you have to keep chasing it, keep going after those goals and those things that you need. And that's how I took it growing up. I thought I'd share that. But we remember these stories. We remember these stories because as long as these stories are going, we'll remember the lessons taught there, and we'll keep that relationship established there. Navajos wouldn't have named this place Brimhall. They probably would have if it was up to them, and if they would have asked Mr. Brimhall if they could. All right. Navajos with names are very touchy about that. Depending on where you're from, what you do for a living, or how you influence someone's life could determine what your name is. For example, when I was in high school, my friends would call me Daga Yaja, which just meant mustache. Because I was in high school and I thought I had a mustache. And I tried to shave it once and I broke out, so I just never shaved again. So I had a little mustache, and so my friends would call me Mustache. They'd call my brother Daga, Hastin Daga, which just means beard, because my dad's not Indian, so I guess we got blessed with facial hair. And so my brother could grow a full beard in high school, and so they called him Beard. And which was funny. But when I started doing work for the Navajo Nation, I would do a lot of work with adoptions. I'd help people adopt, and I'd do the legal work for them. And I'd work a lot with the Child and Family Services of Navajo Nation. And they would, and it was fun. It was a good relationship. And one of my friends went down there, and she and her husband ended up adopting a child. And they were told, you need to hire an attorney to help you finish this adoption off. And they said, well, we don't know any. And then she goes, oh, wait, one of my friends, Dustin Jansen, he's an attorney. And the lady at the adoption, the foster care Navajo Nation was like, you know Dusty Jansen? And she goes, yeah, we went to BYU together. And she was like, oh. And then in Navajo, she goes, yeah, sometimes he'll come up here and help us, because I do pro bono work that way. But she didn't call me Dusty. She called me Hastin Bahajona, which means the happy man, because I guess I laughed a lot when I was with her. But some places call me happy man. Some people call me mustache. My mom calls me Dusty, or there are 4-letter words she's thinking of sometimes. But we normally didn't name things after people unless they were still alive. Because if you say someone's name who's passed away, they say you interrupt their journey, you're interrupting their next experience, their next life. And so sometimes Navajos will add the word ye at the end of a name. So for George Washington, they'd say George Washington ye, which means it's just an indicator that he's passed. And when we indicate that he's passed that way, then his spirit, we don't disrupt his spirit, and he can't disrupt ours. So we'd add those names. So Andrew Jackson, we'd say Andrew Jackson ye, because we don't want his influence in our life. But we did this. So we probably wouldn't do that. We probably wouldn't name, I have friends that wanted to name their kids after their father that had passed, but they couldn't because they never asked their dad if they could. And they didn't want to say his name out loud like that. I was just checking that out. But I was reading about a reporter. I told you the story about El Capitan, and there's this other reporter that came in there, and he was like, I wanted to get the real story behind El Capitan. And he heard the inchworm story, and he found some Miwok native people and said, hey, can you tell me about this inchworm story? And some of the Miwok people hadn't heard it. And they hadn't heard it because no one tells it anymore, right? And so the Miwok story of Inchworm Rock loses its influence, it loses connection with people, and now El Capitan is what these people know that as by now. He was like, no, that's El Capitan. And he goes, it's not inchworm, and he was like, I don't think so. I never heard it called inchworm, because he didn't hear those stories growing up, because he's always been, as a young child, he always heard it as El Capitan, because there are no more natives live in that area either to keep those stories going. And in American Indian Studies, we have this saying that oral history is history. And we rely on that memory to keep things going. And when it doesn't, it can sever that connection between people and land. There's a guy, he's an actor, his name's Floyd Red Crow Westerman. He passed away. So I should say Floyd Red Crow Westerman, yay. Yeah, but he passed away. And something that he said that I really like, he said, there's an Indian saying that something lives only as long as the last person who remembers it. My people have come to trust memory over history. Memory, like fire, is radiant and immutable, while history serves only those who seek to control it. Those who douse the flame of memory in order to put out the dangerous fire of truth. He said, beware these men, for they are dangerous themselves and unwise. Their false history is written in the blood of those who might remember, and of those who seek the truth. Present company excluded. There's probably a bunch of historians here. But that was the process back in the day. You wrote, the winner writes the history, and they write it from their point of view and their perspective, so that that truth outlives them, and we can consult it. So strong is that belief that we dismiss oral histories a lot in favor of written history, right? And I would hope that you would not do that anymore, but treat Native histories as history, too. Sometimes, there's stories like how, you play the game of telephone, how that can distort after a few people down the line. But also, it also forces people to remember harder than you would have otherwise. There was people's jobs in every tribe to remember. That's all they did, was remember and pass on the histories to the next person who was told to remember. Right, and they had to be accurate and they had to be truthful, because there was life lessons learned in these memories. Don't go up there in wintertime. Don't go down here in the summertime, because that might have been life-threatening at that point. So having an accurate memory of these things was really important. So I'd hope that you would follow that. Denali, what was it called before 2016? Mount McKinley, right? They changed it. On the National Park Service 100th anniversary, they changed it to Denali, because it's an Athabascan word, and it just means the high one, but it was what all the Native people in Alaska were using to describe it. It was what most of the communities used to describe Mount McKinley, and so they changed it to that. I have a quote. It says, when an indigenous place is named or renamed, either its ancestral name or a new name, then you're invoking reconnection. The experience of loss or removal becomes part of your history and your healing. When non-natives approach the landscape with openness to its lessons, they can learn their place on it too. When a sacred name persists, it can be an agent of healing. And when you call a place by its sacred name, the stories of that geographic location will always be there. The past comes into contact with the present and creates ceremony. Healing can then take place. And those names, when used, mean the stories will always remain too. And sometimes there's pushback on that, because you'll hear sometimes that we're a Christian nation, and and we don't put a lot of emphasis on other religious beliefs. But I hope that you would. I hope that you'd be more open to that, I hope that when someone doesn't believe exactly as you do, but has information and history and story, that you take that and use it to better your foundation and your understanding. And this is hard because Native people, they don't separate church from anything. Religion and culture are engraved in everything that we do. Vine Deloria, he wrote a lot of rowdy books. They weren't very rowdy, but the titles were really rowdy. I'm not even going to say them. But Vine Deloria, when what he said about land, he says, the idea is not to pretend to own the land, not to exploit it, but to respect it. Trying to get people to see that's a dimension of religion is really difficult. The basic problem is that American society is a rights society rather than a responsibility society. I don't know if there's any Navajos in here, but if there are, normally we introduce ourselves by our clans. And so we say this, I would say, Kintlachini Nishle, as I'm born into the Red House people. Bilagana Bashashin, my dad's white, so I say I'm born for my dad's people. I don't want to say white people, he's Danish. And then my maternal grandfather, he is from, they call the one who walks around people, Honagani Dashiche, right? And on my nully, or my dad's dad, he was also Danish too, so we just say that. But usually in a traditional introduction, you would end by saying, Akut Aldenanishla, which means that's what makes me a Navajo, or that's what makes me a Navajo man. So it creates relationship between people. I'll do this in class, and I'll have some students come up to me afterwards and say, hey, you're my grandpa, clan-wise. And I'm like, really? Not your uncle? Or and they would say, they'd see me in the hallway, hey, grandpa. They'd say, Che. Hey, Che, I'm hungry. I'm like, yeah, okay. So we go talk about it and get them something to eat, right? Because they've invoked that relationship. And I honor that relationship. It helps people. For Navajo, it's about not ever being alone. But really, relationships are to everything, right? In Navajo, we say, K'ah. K'ah means that relationship, our connection to something. Instead of saying we have a right to land or we should own land, we should probably say, I have a relationship with that land, so I'm accountable to it. Instead of I own water, I'm accountable to that water. Instead of these beautiful places that are all over Utah, instead of arguing about who owns it and who should control it and who should make the most money off it, the question should be, how can we preserve this? How can we be accountable to this land and treat it in a way that we'd want it to treat us? And that's the big thing about introducing clans. It's not just to say your lineage, but it's to establish relationship and remind you of your relationship with everything around you. Now, I don't know if these words will support any of the rest of the conference sessions, but I do hope that you'll take it in a good way. I hope that you'll take it in a way that as a tool to help expand what your thought process is, what your thinking is, as a tool to maybe lead you to a closer relationship with the geography around you, whatever that may be. And in so doing, get stronger relationships with the people around you and all living things. It doesn't mean that just because we're different culturally, it doesn't mean that these lessons can't provide hope and inspiration to abide in every one of us. I didn't know I did this. I was going to end with the perception, creates public policy. I'll still say that. Public perception creates public policy. I hope you're seeing areas different now. And if you're kind of upset about the Secretary of Interior changing all the names of Squaw, I hope you get over it and are okay with that. And it doesn't mean that natives named every place correctly, right? Sometimes it's just a description of what we're seeing. But I would hope that you don't discount the native voice and knowledge in these areas. Reach out to your tribal leaders. We have 8 tribal governments in Utah that are fantastic to work with, and they are more than willing to help in any way to share knowledge and to create a better Utah for people. I guess I'll show this. Anyway, the guy on the top left is my great-grandfather. His name is Keani Nez. That means, Keani means towering house, Nez means tall. So I guess, they say he was big. They say he's like 6'6". So much, he was so big that people are wondering if he was even Navajo. Okay, because when they came back, he joined Navajo Nation on the way back from the Long Walk. And there was a lot of tribes in those areas that were raiding the areas, and the Navajo women went through a lot on those walks. And so they think he's actually Kiowa and Ute. And somehow a Navajo family picked him up and just culturally raised him Navajo, and he ended up becoming a medicine man down there. The guy on this way, his name is John Vicente, or the Spanish called him calabaza, which means like squash. But he was a scout for the U.S. military in the Apache campaigns. And I met some Apaches in Arizona, and I told them that my great-grandma's husband, or father, was a scout in the Apache campaigns. And they said, "Oh, what's his name?" I said, "John Vicente, or Calabaza." And they're like, "Hey, you should come over here." And so they took me to another place, and this lady talked about how Calabaza, or John Vicente, released all the Apaches from a jail after helping the U.S. capture them. It's this job preservation. Oh, we have to get him again, So they have this story about him. That's my grandma, get on that side. That's my great-grandma. I keep them in mind because these two basically raised me. My parents were pretty busy growing up, and so we lived right 100 yards behind them, so I just hang out with those two all day. My great-grandma, her name was Natlenesba. It's just, if you hear a Navajo women's name, they name Ba, it's a warrior name, warrior designation name. They said there was a time when all the men went off to fight, and while they were gone, the women were attacked, and all the women fought off the attackers, and so they all got warrior names. And so it's kind of a tradition to give your girls warrior names. So hers is Natlenesba, which means returns to war. That's what she did. And they were really influential in my life. And the stories that they told me still stay with me. And, the life lessons they taught me stay with me. And they affect everything I do, and how I treat people, and how I treat things around me, and how I raise my family. And I hope that this kind of made sense to you. I hope that this is enlightening somehow, and that you'll take it to your other breakout sessions and back to work and put it to use somehow. But thank you very much for this time. And you have a wonderful conference.